By the way, Camille Gregor's in the house, and he says, if there was a button that would wipe all memory of your deconversion and make you wake up a Christian, or wake up the Christian you used to be, would you push it?
No, that's a good question. No, because as of right now, I believe that it's false. And so I wouldn't intentionally force myself. I wasn't like happier. Actually, this is, I don't talk about this one that much. I did a little bit in my first video.
I love where this is going, by the way.
Yeah. Part of what came about in my deconversion was, without going too personal, I went through some things in my life, and then I went on kind of like a finding myself, as existential as as that sounds, but I really worked on myself to become a person that I'm very comfortable in my skin, who I love being. I mean, I was never like super not that before, but there was tension, and there was a lot of ways I think where I had suppressed some of like myself within Christianity for various reasons. And so I'm actually
brother. I relate.
Yeah. So like there's actually a sense where I'm much more like authentically and holistically myself after this conversion. So it's not even like I missed the bygone days, where I had like, hope and happiness and all that kind of stuff. Like that wasn't necessarily my experience back then. I mean, it was in some ways. And I think in those moments I would have said that it was, but looking back, I don't think that I would. Although I will confess, I am like, if someone could convince me that it was true, right? Not I could just wipe my memory and go back, but right now I know that I do believe something about. If someone could convince me that it was true again, I'd be totally fine with it. Like I'm not. Yeah.
Thank you for the super chat, Camille, and thank you for answering that. So you have this. We'll use the term pagan, ancient Near East is what I like to say, but there's an evolution. God evolves, and so. And if this God is active in the world, it's kind of weird how it always models itself with the mind of the people at the time. And eventually philosophers getting more sophisticated, they even the biblical ones, New Testament and later exegetes are like, we have this God that is not the depiction of Yahweh that we see in the biblical text. In fact, you got like early church fathers like Justin Martyr who actually want to say Aristotle, some of these philosophers that were pagan, I'll say, but they weren't pagan in the definition, so to speak, that you're saying. They actually would think of more of like a higher Platonic God that is perfect form and all that. So like they called them Christians. Some of these early church fathers were calling these non-Jesus followers Christians because their model of God philosophically was starting to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was in line with the model of God. Now, they would push back because then obviously Aristotle and stuff wasn't saying that Jesus is the unique Son of God and all that.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, but what they viewed kind of the ontology sans the Trinity or whatever that is. What those what are called in systematic theology the incommunicable attributes of God.
Right.
Those were very much present. In kind of those pagan philosophers that they were dealing with, those the Platonic philosophers. So it's very much present.
So God, you smack dab in the face of God of the Bible, and you're now like at conflict. Is this an early stage or is this like a late stage in your deconversion?
No, this is one of the early stage. So it's strange. I was not a young earth creationist for very long. When I first became a Christian, I was like, oh, well, that's just because where I was saved out of, young earth creationism, like that was just what Christians did. So I was like, okay, like I'm going to go along with it, but it's, whatever it is, what it is. Quickly, that phase did not last very long. Went to kind of just like I don't really know, I don't know what to do with it, but I did a whole research project and came away basically thinking, and I still think that the most likely thing that's happening in Genesis 1 is that it's an ancient Near Eastern temple text. Right. Right. It's not talking about material creation, kind of like a John Walton type of view, mixed with, So kind of a mix.
That's a whole nother.
I think there's a little bit of a Kleinian like framework theory. There's a whole bunch of things going on there. But I did a whole series on that. But what I think what that did was that, it trained me to also that's where I got a lot of my training and hermeneutics and understanding ancient Near Eastern contexts and backgrounds and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of people will be like, oh well, your view of Genesis 1 is the thing that did you in. And indirectly it might have, because it's the thing where I was like, okay, but like good historical hermeneutics, dealing with the history and the grammar and the context and backgrounds and all that kind of stuff, when we start employing that kind of across the board, that's when we start that, that hermeneutic is the thing that I think started kind of doing me in, not necessarily just isolated my view of Genesis 1. Right. So that started to go through, and we go, and when you start looking through the ways, and polemics can only get you so far. Although I think there is polemics that are happening in Genesis 1. I think there's polemics that's happening in the Exodus cycle and the plagues and the strong right arm is one of my like favorite polemics in the scriptures. So, there is a bunch of that stuff that's happening, but that hermeneutic of reading things within their historical context and seeing that the way that the biblical text is actually interacting with those things, and then carrying that forward into the New Testament, and seeing the way that they're interacting with the literature of their day, and how Mark is actually, there are all these theories about what they're interacting with, and Homeric myths and all that kind of stuff. I don't go necessarily that far, but I think Mark, the Messianic secret is a very interesting kind of inversion of what's happening with the announcement of a Caesar. It's actually showing that he's the humble king, right? So there's all these kinds of like interactions that are happening that don't necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily mean that Christianity is false or that the Bible is false, right? You can, and I did for a long time. I read these as, that's just, kind of a Mike Laconian, that's the literary genre that they're doing, and that's okay. But those types of things just start to build and build and build and build and balloon until there's so many of them that it becomes a point that it's like, okay, there's so many of these, and it addresses almost everything, that at what point do I think that any of this is actually true anymore? It's interesting and it's fascinating, and
I love it.
Things.
Yes.
But at what point does any of this now like matter for salvation anymore?
Right. So did it steal the magic away in a different way? I mean, the faith magic, like is there a sense where you're kind of like, I'm actually grasping the literature now. Like I get what they're trying to do. I saw behind the curtain. I love it for what it is now, but I don't see how this is abracadabra for me anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was interesting. One of the things that really did me in, and kind of turned the tides when it comes to seeing the biblical contradictions and not trying to harmonize like the Gospels anymore, which is big. That's a big thing. When you can stop trying to harmonize every single passage, once that shift happens, I'm sure you're smiling. I'm sure you get this feeling. Once that shift happens, you're like what was completely reasonable. And I still say it, like, I get it. Like, I don't necessarily think it's a bad way to think about things. Like a lot of times we try to understand things in the context of things that we think are more true. It's not intrinsically bad to hold beliefs simply because they are the most consistent with other things that you do have a warrant to believe it. I don't think that's a bad reason to hold. It's just not a strong reason. And once that goes away, you start looking at a bunch of the things you're believing, and you're like, well, now it's like a domino. Now that this one anchor thing that made all these other things consistent is gone, once that's gone, well, crap, like all the other 100 things domino after it and are gone. So the thing that did me in, actually, the domino, was because I love the literature. I love it. And I love the theme development. And I love like understanding what was Paul's theme of election in Romans.
Right.
And I listened to a talk with Bart Ehrman, because you have to, whether you like him or not, right? We both like him, whether Christians like him or not. But I remember listening, and he was like, "Look,
who is it again? I'm sorry.
Yes, who is he? Bart Ehrman, right? So,
okay,
yeah. So when he was talking about how if you take it was the time of the crucifixion between Mark and John.
Right.
And if you try to harmonize those, you actually destroy the theme of Mark individually and John individually, because John has him as the sacrificial lamb. It has to be the day of preparation for the Passover, because that's that. If you break that, you break a major theme in John, right? You break it. If it's not Passover, you break the messianic secret in Mark, right? So if you harmonize them, you're creating a third gospel. Bart Ehrman's famous for saying this. You're creating your own gospel, but you are breaking the two gospels. You're not harmonizing them and keeping them you're not keeping them harmonious. You're actually breaking the original data. And the original data is beautiful. They're brilliant on their own. They just can't be harmonized and stay brilliant.